Have you ever asked yourself whether something is nice to do versus need to do? There are many times in our lives, personal or professional, when faced with a decision that at times is nice to do and at other times is a need to do. For example, vacation. As much as we may feel it is necessary, it is a nice option to have. Earning an income, on the other hand, is something that is needed. It's necessary for what we need to do in order to live our lives. We need to eat, and it's nice to go out to a restaurant to do it. Here's one more. The Bank of Canada is in a position where it needs to cut interest rates to avoid the economy from falling into a recession. The strength of the U.S. economy, however, puts the Federal Reserve in a position where immediate rate cuts aren't needed, but it's nice to have the option. When we think of interest rate policy in that way, rate cuts in Canada are much more of a certainty, whereas in the United States, not so much. I'm Philip Petursson, Chief Investment Strategist at IG Wealth Management. Join me each week as we discuss the trends dominating the investment landscape. It's the week of January 29th, so listen on as we navigate the living market. There should have been no surprise that the Bank of Canada continued to hold its overnight rate firm last week, nor the Federal Reserve this week. With the inflation fight seemingly won, the next consideration by either central bank will be when to cut or risk unintended damage from restrictive monetary policy. In other words, if interest rates are left at their current level for too long, the negative effects will start to compound. The tone of the Bank of Canada's statement said it all. The bank outlined the case for slower global economic growth while seemingly acknowledging that the Canadian economy is in a recession. With comments that the economy has stalled since the middle of 2023 and growth will likely remain close to zero through the first quarter of 2024, the bank is all but using the R word. Despite inflation ticking higher for December, the Bank of Canada is no doubt aware that excluding mortgage interest costs, inflation on a year-over-year basis was 2.5% and well within the Bank of Canada's target range. The Bank of Canada has to realize that the higher interest rates are keeping headline inflation higher, not lower. It is therefore without a doubt that the direction for rates is lower, not higher. The statement continued along the narrative that the Governing Council wants to see further and sustained easing in core inflation, while also highlighting that shelter costs remain the biggest contributor. If it weren't for the already weakened Canadian economy, we may have taken this more seriously, that this might suggest rate cuts are further out, but that's not likely the case. As we model out inflation over the next 6 months, using a conservative forecast of 0.25% month over month, we see inflation trending upwards in February due to base effects, and then trending downwards towards 2.9% by the summertime. The 20-year average for CPI in Canada is 2.5%, so we're not that far off from the long-term trend. Trying to read between the lines as to when the bank might initiate its first cut leads to a second quarter target. To support the bank's belief that housing spending will likely pick up in the second half of 2024, we would need to see relief for the consumer. That relief can only come with interest rate cuts given the current mortgage and rent burden. We heavily discount the somewhat hawkish-leaning comments from Macklem following the statement. Given the data in front of us, rate cuts are the only logical next step. It is obvious that the Canadian economy has stalled. Rate hikes have done their job. It is the Bank of Canada's own policy of higher rates that is keeping inflation above its target range, that is, mortgage interest costs. Cutting interest rates solves two problems. One, it lowers inflation and supports the stagnant economy. Two, whether the Bank of Canada governor wants to admit it or not, the Canadian economy needs rate cuts. If not April, then most certainly June. I'm Philip Petursson, and you've been listening to Living Market. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please take a moment to rate it or share it with colleagues and friends. It will help other like-minded individuals find us.
The content of this podcast, including facts, views, opinions, and recommendations, is not to be used or construed as investment advice and is not an offer or an invitation to buy or sell any security. The content of this podcast should not be relied upon for any purpose, and IG Wealth Management is not responsible for any reliance upon it. This podcast includes forward-looking information that reflects our current expectations or forecasts of future events. Forward-looking information is subject to risks, uncertainties, and assumptions that could cause actual results to differ materially from expressed herein. Our views are subject to change based on market conditions. Commissions, fees, and expenses may be associated with mutual fund investments. Read the prospectus before investing. Mutual funds are not guaranteed, values change frequently, and past performance may not be repeated.